Hi there, I'm Retro Guy. You may have seen me in the previous video of Retro Spotlight. Well, Retro Spotlight is changing. We're becoming a new show called Retro Daze. Retro Daze will be more than just about the games themselves, but about the game systems, gaming personalities from back then, back in the 80s and 90s, the hardware, some modern technologies that is helping to make retro gaming easier and more accessible to everybody. That's what Retro Daze is going to be about. And starting today, premiere episode of Retro Daze. I hope you like it. I've been working really hard on it. So I will see you in now. Hello there, I'm Retro Guy, and this is Retro Daze. Retro Daze is a show that covers all things retro gaming, whether it is the classic hardware, the companies that made the games, even the personalities, the developers who worked on the games. Today, we're going to cover an important subject. You see, our previous show, Retro Spotlight, which is now a segment of our show, was covering classic arcade games from a company called SNK. Today, we're going to learn a little bit about the company and how it started. Now, the company that we know of as SNK actually started in 1973 as Shin Nihon Kikaku. Later, it was reorganized in 1978 as a corporation, or what the Japanese called a stock company, called Shin Nihon Kikaku Corporation. Around that time, the company's head, Eikichi Kawasaki, noticed that arcade games were becoming a big thing. He was noticing the expanding growth of that market, and so he expanded the company to include development and marketing of coin-op arcade games. Their first game was a side-scrolling shooter called Ozma Wars, which came out in 1979. However, SNK didn't become well known for arcade games until 1980, when they released Vanguard. Put their name on the map, so to speak. Around the time that they were releasing Ozma Wars, the company shrank its name down to its abbreviations, SNK, or down to SNK Corp., and opened an office in Sunnydale, California. There they would market games for the North American market. Between 1979 and 1986, SNK produced over 23 arcade games. Retro Spotlight covered 2 of these games from that era. Alpha Mission in 1985 and Athena from 1986. However, SNK's most successful game from that time came in 1986, Ikari Warriors, which we will be highlighting today in our Retro Spotlight section. Japan was affected by the video game crash in 1983, but SNK weathered it and would later become a licensee of games for the Nintendo Famicom. In 1985, SNK would open a second U.S. office called SNK Home Entertainment. This was opened up in Torrance, California, and it was specifically for marketing video games to home console market, including for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, in 1988, the company created the idea of a modular arcade cabinet system. This would become the Neo Geo MVS later on, that we know of from the 90s. Now, the Neo Geo would bring us a ton of games, some of which have been covered here on Gamers Bay. While the Neo Geo system itself was very expensive, the games that you could play at home were the exact same games you could play in the arcades. It even had a memory card so that you could insert the card into the arcade cabinet, play a game, save your progress, and then go home, plug in the game, which was the exact same game in the arcades, and continue where you left off. The Neo Geo's legacy was huge. Now, unfortunately, the original Neo Geo as a corporation is gone. The company was bought up by a Chinese interest, and so though the SNK name is still around and there are still games made under the SNK label, the original Japanese SNK company is no longer with us. However, we still have the legacy of the arcade games that they brought us in the 80s and 90s. And today we're going to spotlight one such game. A game that made SNK a big name in arcades. Today, on Retro Spotlight, we're taking a look at Ikari Warriors.
Thank you, Retro Guy! Well, we're looking at Ikari Warriors. This came out in 1986, and this was the game that basically put SNK on the map in the North American arcade market. SNK didn't become a household name until much later, when they brought the Neo Geo out to North America, and a lot of games like King of Fighters series and a lot of their other fighting games started becoming really popular. This game, I played this game once, a long time ago. I don't remember which arcade it was I played it at. I know I've seen this several places. Just like one of the other previous games that we covered on Retro Spotlight, this uses the rotary control, where you can turn your character and fire in multiple different directions. You have your basic gun, you have your hand grenades, and just like the other game, you can also get a tank, and you keep yourself going by picking up fuel when you take damage in the tank. And unlike a lot of other games, there's no levels in this one. You just keep going. It just keeps scrolling up and up and up, and the amount of enemies that come at you just escalates, as you can see here, over time, until you finally get to the end. There have been a lot of these games, a lot of what they call commando clones like this that have come out in arcades quite often. There were some for the Commodore 64. I remember one that I played that I really liked, which I will be covering in a future Retro Spotlight on the show, is Rambo for the Commodore 64. That was a really fun game, and the audio was incredible for the time on the Commodore. But here, yeah, we're seriously just kicking butt here with the tank. The game's a lot harder than this in the arcade. You can change some difficulty settings and things if you're using MAME or some other emulators. You can just plow through this like crazy. And some of the things that they throw at you in this game is just insane for the era. The graphics, pretty good for their time. I would say this was around the time that the NES was out already. So this was a little above what the NES was capable of. There was a lot of games that were beginning to push graphics quality. At that time, the Neo Geo MVS system had not yet become a thing yet. That wouldn't be until like the 90s. It was already in development by this time, and the hardware would start going out around 88, about that time. But this was not done on the MVS. The MVS would be capable of much better visuals than what this can do. The hardware on this was most likely what most arcade games back in the 80s used, all the way up to the 90s, in MOS 6502. But it would have had some accompanying chips to improve the graphics. The sound effects are, well, for the era, a bit bog standard for the era for arcade games at the time. But back then, this was fun. This was the game that people really loved playing, and this is probably one of SNK's most well-known arcade games. It's a 2-player game, and here we go. Oh, some more baddies. They're starting to throw flamethrowers at us. As you can see, there's no level. There's just continuing on, going forward, marching on. More tanks getting blown up. Those grenades are a bit OP. You soon hear, yep, that's where we're starting to see the statues shooting laser beams. They just escalate the attacks against you. This game gets pretty difficult later on. Anyway, a lot of games like this were coming out around the time. As I said, there were a lot of clones for Commando and Ikari Warriors clones, and there were a few games in the series, and we will be covering those here in Retro Spotlight. There are 3 titles in the Ikari series. The second one we'll be doing in the next episode. We're here crossing another bridge, and just enemies just pouring across. Now a large field. Let's see what we're going to be facing here. More tanks. Alright, some more buildings. Another gate. That went down. More enemies up on the wall. Ah, now we got a tank. Okay, yep, time to plow. Blow up buildings. We're just ripping our way through here. The strangest thing with this is there's no end boss. You fight your way through just a ton of wave of enemies, and then the game just abruptly ends. You'll see here soon. You get plentiful upgrades or power-ups. You can keep grenades on hand. I mean, look at the number of grenades we've got here. We don't even have to use our gun. We just throw grenades at everything. And the grenades just basically one-shot everything, or just about one-shot everything. Now helicopters. And this game is a part of the whole power fantasy genre. One guy like Rambo or Arnold Schwarzenegger just tearing his way through the game, destroying all the enemies in his path, just blowing up everything. All one dude, a single guy just taking on an entire army. And this has been a trope in movies and games for a long time. Oh, fire flamethrowers there. Taking them out. More enemies. Cannon fodder. Oh, blowing them up. More enemies. They just don't know when to stop. Alright, you could sort of say this is the boss. Take that down. more enemies. And we rescue our guy. And that's it. That's Ikari Warriors. That's the entire game. Right, and now back to you, Retro Guy.
Thanks, Mike. That was Ikari Warriors. Next time, we'll be covering more SNK games in our Retro Spotlight. Until next time, I've been the Retro Guy, and this has been Retro Daze. See you next time.